It's a 3 series. So what I'm trying to do, because initially I planned it into 5 and 4, so we'll condense them all into the 3, and I'll just speak a little bit quicker and faster, and you will slow me down just to make sure that everything makes sense. Anyway, welcome back, everybody. And again, just to start, thanking the Achsania of Beth Jacob for hosting this again, and Rabbi Posey and Rabbi Top and everyone involved there. And in particular, Dr. Ann Winter, our fearless leader, whom she's so on top of it and sending stuff, and you guys know everything. At least our old Chabura that I see here gets notations before anyone else. So that's one amazing privilege. So I'm not sure if Dr. Ann Winter's on, but I'll try to remember at the end too. And it's very important in life to be thankful. Hakarat HaTov is something that we all need to do. You might have heard my lectures somewhere, I don't remember where it is, about exactly this point. But this is not a rabbinic lecture. This is now a Jewish history. And let's continue where we left off and somehow try to come to figure out the roots of what we call modern Orthodoxy today. And of course, like anything else in Jewish history, the answer is not simple. There are no simple things when you deal with the Jewish people. The Jewish people are very complex, they're very sophisticated. And of course, that famous line in so many different variations, every Jew's the president of his own shul. Every Jew knows better than the rabbi. And Hashem said it so well, we are the Amkshe Oref. We are a very stiff-necked people, which sometimes gets us into trouble, but sometimes it's also what saves us. Having said all that, let me review a little bit of the people that we need to remember on this road to modern Orthodoxy. And that is Chacham Bernays, Chacham Yitzchak Bernays, if you remember, who had come up. And one of the great rabbis that we mentioned last time was Rabbi Yaakov Etlinger. Now, Rabbi Yaakov Etlinger, who was very friendly with Bernays, and they signed off together on so many things, were very similar. Both had attended university, and both had been the first rabbis in Europe, basically, to actually deliver a drasha, to deliver a sermon in the vernacular. That was a chidush in the early 1800s. The rabbis spoke either in Yiddish or now what rabbis had spoken in the Eidot HaMizrach communities of the medieval period. Was it Judeo-Arabic? Was it only Hebrew? That's a little bit debatable, but there the issue never really was like, oh my gosh, you're discussing like the language of the non-Jew. But in Germany, these two rabbis understood. As much as, and I'll put a parenthesis in here, as much as in antiquity, for those of you who've been on this series now forever, remember when we discussed the translation of Torah into Greek. Looking at rabbinic sources about the Septuagint, the rabbis were not very happy with it. On the one hand, they ascribed to it almost miraculous mistranslations because all the rabbis, they're not rabbis actually, that title doesn't exist in that time period, but the sages, if you wanted, the Zakanim, these elders who mistranslate these amazing 13, 15, 18, depending on which version you take, mistranslations identically. It must have been a miracle. Yet a fast day was established. The 8th day of Tevet was a fast day in antiquity because of the translation of Torah into Greek. Torah was the property of the Jewish people. But there were so many Jews who spoke Greek. And that translation actually saved a generation, 2, 3, 4, and eventually Greek seeped in and everyone spoke Greek and etc. Look at the ArtScroll translation in the United States. Look at JPS. the Jewish Publication Society, in whatever role it is today, it was quite influential in this country in bringing about the translation of Torah into English. In Germany, and just a little plug here, when this series will continue after the Chagim, and not Pesach, I mean the other Chagim, we will shift to Jewish history in America. And of course, the trajectory there will also be modern Orthodoxy. And of course, you see what's beginning to happen. When I speak of modern Orthodoxy in 2020, are we referring to the modern Orthodoxy of Israel, the modern Orthodoxy of America, the modern Orthodoxy of Europe? And the models are different, and they're very different. And how modern Orthodoxy develops in America, is it even connected to what we're doing now? And that's part of what we're trying to figure out here. So this Rabbi Yaakov Etlinger, the Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva in Mannheim, wrote Sfarim of Halacha, spoke in the vernacular, had gone to university, so had Bernays. Yet on the periphery here, quite important, but we're not discussing much, we keep on mentioning, was the Reform movement, the Enlightened Jews. And we mentioned a drop of it last time, but let me start with it more this time. It's in this time period that that famous school of Wissenschaft das Judentum arises. Wissenschaft das Judentum, translated loosely, is something like the science of Judaism. There were a number of enlightened, quotation mark, Jews in Germany, and not just in Germany, in Italy, even as far as Prague, and slightly more into Eastern Europe. Beyond that, because of the influence of Mendelssohn, that began to wonder, what is the future of the Jewish people? And in Germany, a number of people began to figure out, wait a second. Now, names like Moritz Steinschneider, Leopold Zunz, or Yom Tov Lippmann Zunz, to a certain degree, even Abraham Geiger, who we'll get back to for a different reason, belonged to a particular group that called itself Wissenschaft das Judentum, beginning with this fellow Zunz, who was an amazing scholar. And let me just share a number of pictures of him, if I can actually find them. Okay, let me share the screen with you for a second. Bear with me. I'm going to get rid of a couple of things. Okay, got it. Hold on. Here is Zunz in his later years. Okay. Yom Tov Lippmann Zunz, who could be labeled traditional, if you want, and enlightened totally, but believed that Judaism, what you would call today, and again, the term isn't yet used, Orthodox Judaism, was dead. It was on its way to its last funeral. Modernity, enlightenment, change will bring about the demise of the old ritual Jewish religion to such a degree that we need to study it and have a record of it before it's actually buried. And how do we do that? And Zunz made an eloquent statement in beautiful German, where he basically said the Jewish people have created a massive, I'll say it again, massive literature. There were midrashim, prayers, Jewish poetry, and Jewish religious poetry, Jewish philosophy. My goodness, what the Jewish people have produced when others were illiterate. We need to study all this stuff. We need to find all the manuscripts of everything. And imagine this is a massive undertaking. And people like Steinschneider and Suntz and a few others began to really amass lists of manuscripts of Rashi, Yehuda Levi's poetry, every possible midrash version and manuscript of Talmud, and study it and look at it and catalog it. And Suntz, on his own, literally, sat there day and night, writing and writing and writing, voluminous, getting like lists of what every library in Europe had that was Jewish, and looking at many of them and traveling. And this brought about a new way of studying. In a small scale, this might have been done before, but suddenly this Wissenschaft das Judentum created a historical awareness of the past where everything had to be put in its proper compartment, and it had a history. And you saw development, and you saw how an idea was first mentioned here and how it grew back to the concept of, let's say, Greek. Oh, there are Greek words in the Talmud. How many? Where are they? How and what kind of a Greek was it? Let's study it. How much Greek did the rabbis know? How about Latin? Are there Latin words? Well, let's find them. Let's look at, and suddenly people began to catalog and look at everything in a historical way. Now, what that did many times, it brought about questions of questioning the old traditions. And they assumed, oh, this was true. But when we look at these documents, we see a different picture. When you study this, you see wait a second, we thought this was true. And in this way, Wissenschaft das Judentum was not with the purpose of study Torah, study Midrash, study Halacha, with the idea of doing the mitzvah, of keeping the Halacha. It was to study it in a scientific way, with a methodology, with evidence, with what came out of the German historical schools of the very famous Wilhelm Ranke, if you remember, the father of modern history, of critical sources, and when was the first mention of a particular word, and let's just take it all apart. It wasn't more like I will study the poetry of Yehuda Levi for Yom Kippur service to recite on Yom Kippur. It was to see the theme, the meter, how was it arranged. Many people who were not part of the Enlightened people, the Reform movement, began to look at this movement as something very positive. And of course, many were opposed to it. Having said that, let's put that in the background. And let me just show you for a second and share the screen of two other people. Now watch two people who okay, let me share this one with you first. Okay, hold on and look at him. Here is Shmuel David Luzzatto, professor in Parma in the 1800s. Now, Luzzatto had been born in 1800, literally the 1800 straight, died in 1865. One of the most prominent rabbis in Italy. Totally traditional, totally Orthodox if you want. Wrote commentaries, gave smicha, taught students, ran a yeshiva. he called himself a member of this Wissenschaft das Judentum. Would you, by the way, we look at things with our first impression, which is always wrong, think of him as a rabbi? Well, he looks quite well dressed for the time period. He's got the latest fashion. He must have gone to Paris to buy his clothing. He looks good. But look at this enlightened, wonderful rabbi, and I have nothing bad, God forbid, to say. Luzzatto is an amazing human being. Okay, let me share this screen with you now. Here's another enlightened rabbi, and tell me if you recognize him. Him and Luzzatto and Steinschneider and Zunz corresponded with each other. Here is another Wissenschaft das Judentum member. This is Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport. Don't say Hasidic Rebbe because he's not, but he's just like what we envision Hasidim to be. So these were members of this club, of this school, of this idea of Wissenschaft das Judentum. It was producing works. For example, Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport, who's known simply as Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport, Shin Yud Reis, Shir, Chacham Shir. And he wrote letters to everyone, to Reform Jews. He didn't care. He wanted information. He wanted to study. He wanted to learn. Again, not for the performance of mitzvot that he did on his own. He didn't worry about that. He wanted knowledge. This knowledge, to jump for a minute, is, and I said this last time in small, but I'll say it with a stronger point, this lecture wouldn't take place if Wissenschaft das Judentum did not put the idea of studying Jewish history seriously, analyzing sources. Now, Jewish history was always studied, but with the idea that whatever was written was true, it was in a book, it must be so. If there was a discrepancy, oh, let's find, like, if you've ever learned Talmud, the Tosafos come to one statement in Talmud that says X, another statement in the Talmud about the same topic says Y, not X, but Y. And like, wait a second, they're contradictory. No, they're not. I'll resolve it. This one is discussing this idea, this is discussing that idea. And that is how Jewish history was resolved without, let's go back to the source, look it up. Can we date the sources? When was it actually recorded? Is it, if it's written in the 700s, was it copying from an early manuscripts of the 500s? These are the tools that Wissenschaft das Judentum built, and therefore Jewish history today is a serious subject. So you cannot have Jewish history today without saying thank you to Wissenschaft das Judentum. That's very clear. Now, how much of this has seeped into modern Orthodoxy? And modern Orthodoxy, I'm just going to be controversial for a minute, might even label this Torah learning. This is very important to keep in mind, because what happens next in Germany will explain the trajectory of what's about to unfold. Two great people will study with Rabbi Yaakov Etlinger and with Bernays. And these two great people are Azriel Hildesheimer and Samson Raphael Hirsch. Two amazing human beings. But before I discuss them, let me share a different screen with you. Get rid of Rappaport, Shadal, and I think it's the right one. It looks good. Now, if you see this, just enlarge it a drop. Can't buy it, even though it looks like a book. Look at the title of this book. Forget the German that this is classified under. The name of the book is Yaakov Etlinger, His Life and Work, The Emergence of Modern Orthodoxy in Germany. Now, this was a PhD done by Dr. Judith Bleich. Hashem should give her a long life, an amazing woman. I believe she must be in her 80s or early 80s, on Mea Be'esrim and more, who did this as a PhD at NYU in 1978. It was never published. I asked her about it. She sent me a copy of it. I thought it was published. It was not. I read through it in December around Hanukkah time when she had sent it to me, and I should be just kind for a minute and do a sales job just as a thank you to her. She recently published a book. It is fabulous. Defenders of the Faith, studies in 19th and 20th century Orthodoxy and Reform by Judith Bleich. I believe she's still teaching. She might even be, I don't think she's the head of the Jewish History Department at Landers College at Truro, but she definitely is still teaching. She has been teaching for at least 4 decades or more. An amazing teacher, an amazing Jewish historian with the eye on the modern period. So if you have nothing to do and you're really interested in the next part of this history that we're not covering, you can read this book. But she claims in that PhD that modern Orthodoxy in Germany begins with Yaakov Etlinger. And she makes a pretty good case. So, but I have to show you another book. And this book I'm not selling because it's been out for a long time. But look at the title of this book. I don't know if you could see it well. I'll move it back a drop maybe. I'll read the title, Rabbi Azriel or Israel Hildesheimer and the Creation of a Modern Jewish Orthodoxy. Now, who gets the title? Is it Yaakov Etlinger or is it Rabbi Hildesheimer? Now, this book was written by David Ellenson, and if you know who David Ellenson is, a very famous, prominent Reform Jew, very wonderful scholar who's written a lot on a real mensch. And he goes through this book and he comes to the conclusion, it was this fellow. Ask people today, and many people will tell you, no. Modern Orthodoxy begins with Rav Hirsch. Now, okay, who's right? Who is? It's Yaakov Bernays, because he was the first rabbi in Germany, and then Etlinger, who followed, who spoke in German and studied. They both had gone to college. So let me tell you a little bit about Azriel Hildesheimer. Oh, maybe no, because he's a little bit younger. Let me tell you about Rav Hirsch. But I assume you've heard about Rav Hirsch, and this is not a lecture about everything about Rav Hirsch. That would take 5 lectures itself. His dates are easy to remember. Rav Hirsch's dates you should never forget. It's almost like Rashi's dates of 1040 to 1105. Don't ever forget that either if you hang around me. Rav Hirsch's dates are all filled with 888. Okay, 1808 to 1888. Got that? 1808. Everything is happening in the 1800s. Again, 1808 to 1888. To discuss Rav Hirsch, what I want to do, I'll share the screen with you and just follow the text that I'm about to put up there. It is quite fabulous. Just scroll to the beginning, and if anybody wants a copy of this, it must be about 50 pages or so. I can definitely send it to you. I do not remember where I got it from. Could very well come from Hebrew books, but I'm not sure. Here it is. Okay, it's a book. I don't know if you can see the corner up here, but I'll watch it's on the next page. It's Memories of Frankfurt by Hermann Schwab. Not related directly to the famous Rabbi Schwab that we'll get to probably today, but definitely a cousin. Now, published in 1955. Okay, it's got these wonderful chapters, etc., etc. There's an introduction. You can read it if you want it. So let's read along. It is an amazing document. Sadly, many historians ignored it. 40 years ago, on a summer morning, we children were taken for a walk. This area here in Frankfurt. We were not far from a particular area, etc. When Samson Raphael Hirsch lived. When my brother, my senior by 2 years, took hold of my hand and whispered, "The Rabbi." We stopped. Accompanied by one of his granddaughters, Samson Raphael Hirsch, stooping slightly, but with firm steps, passed on. He raised his hat to the two small boys who stared at him, the author and his brother, with curiosity. His dark eyes were lit up by a kindly smile on beholding two members of the third generation of his community. This child here, 5 years old at the time, I have never forgotten the friendly gesture of the rabbi, whose venerable figure had become part of my life at a very early age. He had arrived in Frankfurt, so I was told, when my father himself was a little boy. Okay? He came to Frankfurt in 1851. And about 20 years later, the rabbi called upon his kehillah to rebuild it, because it started out, literally, by the way, with about 25 families. It grew to over 500 families. With an inscription of Bet Tfilah Yeshurin in gold letters. The word Yeshurin, written with two vavim, explained the rabbi, as an expression of devotion and piety. The foundation of a secondary school followed that of the synagogue, and the rabbi at first took on all necessary functions himself. This is quite amazing, as an administrator, a headmaster, and teacher. Many young teachers of his choice become subsequently known as outstanding capacity, and one of them we'll get to in a minute. There was Rabbi David Zvi Hoffman, who at that point was the Berliner Rabbiner Seminar, and all these other famous names. My father, this Hermann Schwab writes, was born in 1846, was one of the first pupils in the school. He told us his school days when lessons finished at 8, at 7, etc. Okay? Now, listen to the story. He tells a story. One day, this gentleman came into their classroom and attended a lesson, not about Chumash and Talmud, by the way, but about Greece, its history and culture. This man, whoever he was neither well acquainted with Jupiter and Pallas Athene and then with Mars and Hermes. And he listened, here's the tombstone of Rav Hirsch, with growing bewilderment. And suddenly he asked of Rav Hirsch, "Herr Doctor, may I ask a question?" "Of course," he said. "Children," said the visitor, "I hope you don't believe the stuff that you're learning." The children laughed. And of course, the teacher assured this person who had come that it wouldn't do any harm. Now, what's this line here? Among the highlights of my father's school reminiscences was the celebration of the very famous German poet Schiller. It was his 100th birthday in November of 1858. He was one of the 3 pupils carrying the school's flag with the inscription Torah im derech eretz, which we'll come back to. When all schools were assembled to attend the unveiling of the Schiller statue in Frankfurt. On the same day, the birthday was solemnized in school. The Rabbi, Rav Hirsch, as a headmaster, delivered one of his inspiring addresses, starting with the blessing, which is the bracha that we make when we meet a Chacham Shebagoyim, Shenatan Michvodo Lebasar V'dam, who has given of thy wisdom to mortals. The rabbi quoted Schiller's poems about human greatness and the lofty aims of mankind, the roots of which were to be found in the writings of our sages. He closed with the words of David HaMelech in Tehillim. And he goes on to describe the synagogue in subsequent chapters quite eloquently. But one of the interesting points here, Rav Hirsch, in addition to whatever else he was doing, begins publishing a monthly in German called Yeshurin, a periodical. The Reform had their periodicals. The Wissenschaft das Judentum had their periodicals. Rav Hirsch had his periodical. And he goes on to describe amazing things here, but you can read that on your own. The only thing I want to show you is, it was about 1885, and there were still 3 years granted to me to look into the sunset. This is the author himself of the rabbi's life. He stood before us surrounded by the love and admiration of his community. We were told once again, so imagine, this community knows that he was the founder of a new epoch in the history of German Jewry, that his were the works of a genius, and we were proud and happy that he was our rabbi. And when we heard his sonorous voice, when he was called up to the Torah, when he recited a prayer for the Kaiser, when he read the shofar sounds to the Baltakia, etc. And then, of course, his sermons, which I'll come back to. We boys gathered around the pulpit. The shamash and old man, of course, kept the kids away. But the rabbi never sat down. Never, imagine. He stood upright, in his hand a small Tanakh. It did not matter. We could not understand all the rabbi was saying. Some things we did, especially when he addressed the bar mitzvah boy. But it was, however, and I'm skipping, Yom Kippur of 1888. A few minutes before nightfall, over 1,000 men and women were standing in a beautiful shul that Rav Hirsch had built in Frankfurt. The majesty of that departing day filled the synagogue. From my father's seat in the middle of the synagogue, I could see the pulpit was set up. But he wants to go actually closer. And he goes and he stands close to the rabbi with his kittel and his talit. I saw his shining white hair under his white cap and his eyes wandering silently through the synagogue. And then he spoke. And listen to how familiar this might sound to you. He spoke, he asked his kehillah not to forget, because he spoke of the last amen after the last kaddish. Whenever there may be an hour of fear or sorrow, when good intentions and the faithful promises made fade in the coming years, and then say amen, my brothers and sisters, and Yom Kippur will return to you with all its blessing. And of course, amen was said. And sadly, a little bit later in the month of Tevet of the same year, Rav Hirsch's life had come to an end. The next morning, we learned that my father had stayed in shul. They were all saying Tehillim, and the news of his death spread. 24 hours later, this funeral had taken place. It was a huge funeral. Everyone attended. We get a glimpse a little bit about Rav Hirsch. To read you his curriculum, okay? If you want an idea of what it was, here's if you attended his school, okay? And this, by the way, was recorded by one of his pupils, which we will speak of, Heinrich Gretz, who went on to also become a member of Wissenschaft das Judentum, who eventually did not agree with everything his teacher had written, but still revered him. And I'll read a quote from him a little bit later. But he records the learning of Rav Hirsch with his older pupils. From 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. every day, there was Talmud and Shulchan Aruch. From 6 to 8, it was prayer, tefillah, and breakfast. From 8 to 10, it was Talmud again, but a particular different Masechet. From 10 to 12, it was Greek, the language of Greek, reading the classics in Greek. From 1 to 3, it was history, Latin, physics. From 3 to 5, it was mathematics and geography. And of course, from 6 and on, it was, no, don't ask me when they're eating dinner here. From 6 till 8, roughly, it was Chumash, Tanakh, and Halacha L'Maseh. Okay, try to institute that today in any school with those hours. And by the way, I'll get to the other contemporary of Rav Hirsch, Rabbi Hildesheimer, who we'll speak of in a minute, who has very similar a kind of curriculum and hours. If you've ever heard old European Jews, especially what they call the Oberlander Jews, the Hungarian Jews, let's say, whether they think they're Hasidim or not, they're still trying to figure it out. But their schedule in all those schools was identical. They woke up early in the morning, 4 or 5, never later, and began learning, literally. And davening was later, etc., etc. Today, there is no way in the world a school would even attempt to do that. They would be called abusive, and maybe, I don't know who's right. We're so worried about everything today, like, oh my gosh, don't push. But these people pushed. It was a different understanding of things. But this Rav Hirsch, by the way, his drasha, and we have so much testimony that has survived. And I'm not selling the book, but I must tell you that the Art Scroll biography of Rav Hirsch, quite large, is definitely a book I would recommend. Really quite comprehensive and quite open and scholarly. Is it totally scholarly? No, but it is very, very well presented and everything that's important about his life. But imagine a rabbi whose drasha was exactly 1 hour every single Shabbat. But not like, again, many of you I know are of Yeki background and know what I mean. Okay, Sue, I'm waving to you. Okay, it's the idea of like 9 o'clock I start and 9:59 I end the drasha. But in our drasha, until the end of his life, Rav Hirsch, who had 3 different positions, first in Oldenburg, then he moved to Nikolsburg. Eventually, in 1851, he comes to Frankfurt. He takes this small community, and which is basically reform, and builds it and builds it and builds it and builds it. School, Bet Midrash, a periodical, writing books. But of course, in there is an idea of Torah im derech eretz. Rav Hirsch believed deeply if there's Torah im derech eretz. Now, what derech eretz meant was, that's a debate today, and maybe we'll get to it. And people have argued exactly about what it is, and they're still arguing. But the people who really knew Rav Hirsch and stayed with him, he embraced Western culture. He was not afraid of it. That is not to say that Torah was not supreme to him. It absolutely was. But there was something about the world where the Jew needed to be engaged with the world and not afraid of it. Classical music, of course, there's a beauty in it. There's something there. The poetry of Schiller and of other German poets, studying Greek, there's something there. Now, how all this plays out is very interesting, because this other person that I want to introduce you to, this Azriel Hildesheimer, who also had studied with Rav Hirsch, and Rav Hirsch knew each other very well, who studied with him both with Bernays and with Etlinger. They both had studied with the same people. Both had understood from their teachers, and since they were part of the younger generation of so-called Orthodoxy, that German is the way you speak, and German is the way that the future generation will understand us. So they begin to write books in German. I'll come back to that. But Hildesheimer, born in 1820, you stickler for dates, dies in 1899. His schedule in his yeshiva was kind of interesting, and I had it somewhere. See if I can actually find it. Okay. Hildesheimer lectured on poskim from 4 to 6 a.m. From 8 to 10, this particular year, it was Masechet Gitin. And from 10 to noon, he read German literature with his students. From 2 to 4, they learned Tractate Maragen Chulin. And then, of course, a break to eat. And from 8 to 10 p.m., again, he lectured on the poskim. Shabbat morning, they davened early, and between 8 and 12:30, they were learning a particular Gemara, whatever it might have been. Now, Hildesheimer becomes the rabbi in Berlin. Hildesheimer, almost like Rav Hirsch, writes much more in Hebrew, though. Hildesheimer, as much as he was clearly modern Orthodox, and again, that's the title of the book, decides to take a dream his Rebbe had, and his Rebbe did not succeed. And that was the dream of Rabbi Etlinger, if you remember. And Rabbi Etlinger had said years earlier, but because of financial issues, and I mentioned this, it didn't come to fruition. The only way Orthodoxy, again, they're not using the term, will survive is if we open up a rabbinical seminary. If we have a rabbinical seminary to train rabbis in our thinking, there is a future for our movement. Now, jumping to modern Orthodoxy of today in America, I don't know how much you remember about this debate, but let me just mention it because I'm not sure we'll ever come back to it because it's not that important, but it's important as far as the idea of a rabbinical school. In the United States today, for most people, and if that's rightfully so, we'll figure it out maybe by the end of this series, is the institution of Yeshiva University. Torah Umada, a different idiom, a different aphorism, motto. It's not Torah Derech Eretz. Or is it just the same thing with different words? But it's Torah Umada, Torah and knowledge, science, whatever you want motto to be. There's a rabbinical school. Are they producing modern Orthodox rabbis today? Well, what's modern Orthodoxy? And then this other institution opened up, Chovevei Torah. And there's a rabbinical institution. And there was an entire debate of how does a Jewish movement gain what we've always said the one who dominates the halachic process in the world rules the Jewish world. Wherever the source of halacha is, that is accepted by the majority of the Jewish people, that is where the seat of power, mentoring, future philosophy, leadership will go. Now, who today, and don't answer it, but just think, who holds that power? Is it an institution and the students of its rabbinical school? Think of the different movements in the United States. They all have rabbinical schools. And that's exactly the point. It's a rabbinical school because you want to produce a posek. Has modern Orthodoxy produced a posek, a decisive of Jewish law in America, is the question. We could debate that later on. But both Rav Hirsch and Azriel Hildesheimer are on the same page literally about almost everything, except one issue. And this issue is the other seminary that had opened up in Breslau at the end of the 1850s. In the 1850s, late 1850s, 1857, 59, in Breslau, the seminary opened, the Jewish Theological Seminary of Breslau. It had on its staff Abraham Geiger, a Reform rabbi, a person who knew Rav Hirsch in his youth. They were friends. Actually, they remained friendly, even though in print they attacked each other vehemently. And Abraham Geiger, well, let me show you a picture of him, just to give you an idea of who we're discussing. Let me get rid of this thing here. Here is Abraham Geiger. Almost the same age as Rav Hirsch. In fact, Geiger writes of him later on in life how much they respected each other. They went to school together. They both attended university. So both Hildesheimer, just to clarify, and Rav Hirsch went to university. Hildesheimer in the end did get a degree. Rav Hirsch never received his degree, but they both had secular knowledge and learning, obviously. Geiger tells us that in his college days, he actually studied with Rav Hirsch, Mesechet Zvachim, and they had many discussions. But when it turned to religion, they clearly had different views of many things. And this is the head, or one of the main heads of the seminary in Breslau. Now, Hildesheimer was not very happy with that seminary. It was not. Why not? Because there were people teaching there who did not believe in Torah and mitzvot, who had questions about the authority of rabbis, people who were viewed as slightly, not too much, but maybe they're heretical. There's too much emphasis on this Wissenschaft das Judentum. People who taught there, for example, were Yitzchak Bernay's son, Yaakov Bernay's, a famous Chacham in his own right. The famous Zachariah Frankel taught there, who eventually is given like the title of the father of the conservative movement. Whether that's really accurate or not, we might discuss at the end of the next lecture. But okay, there is, and of course, Heinrich Gretz began to teach Jewish history at the seminary. So Hildesheimer decides he will open up a seminary in Berlin. And in the 1870s, finally, Hildesheimer opens up the Rabbinische Seminary to train rabbis. And it stayed around. And one of the people who ended up teaching there, let me just see, because it's important. Okay. Here is Rav Hoffman. Okay, an amazing human being who had his education in the Hungarian schools. He was born in 1843 and died in, I believe, 1923. He's the author of interesting books that we'll come back to. But what I want to share with you, and let me see if I can actually pull it up. Give me another second. Quite an interesting document. Give me 30 seconds and then this one I did not leave open. Okay, let me pull it up. Okay, got it. Here is a book, and I'll translate, do not get nervous, Melamed Laho'il, by, these are the Shelot and Shuvot of Rav David Tzvi Hoffman. In the second volume, in response to number 59, Nun Vav, a question was sent to him. So this David Tzvi Hoffman, having come from Hungary, comes to Germany. And as you saw earlier in Hermann Schwab's account, he actually was a teacher in Rav Hirsch's schools and went on to become part of Hildesheimer's seminary. And he was asked the question, is one allowed to swear in a non-Jewish court bareheaded? So he goes on to answer it. And I need the next page. And he quotes the sources where he says, Hine ba'et hazot, in this time period, the Rabbanim HaYireim in Ungarn, the rabbis of Hungary are very stringent about covering one's head. And he quotes a number of sources. And then he says, according to them, this is a real prohibition of not following the ways of the non-Jews, and therefore you have to wear all the time a head covering. And he says, but Hine b'kahala kadisha Yireim of Frankfurt, in the Bet HaChinuch, into school in Frankfurt, which was founded by Rav Hirsch, who, of course, by this time had passed away, where he says, Shani, I, David Tzvi Hoffman, was a teacher there for 2.5 years. Yoshvim HaTalmidim, the students sit, B'shad halimud shar hamadaim b'friad rosh. They sit during secular studies when they're learning Greek, when they're doing German poetry, bareheaded. Rak at the time, B'shat limud Torah, when they're learning Torah, then they cover their heads. And so he says that's the same true in Hamburg. And this was done by none other than Rav Hirsch. And then he says an amazing story. Uvafam Harisham, the first time when I came to the house of Rav Hirsch with a kova al roshi, with the head covered with my hat, Amali, Rav Hirsch told me, Shekan, what's the words here in Germany? It's derech eretz. Translate that any way you want to. Lahasir hakova me'al harosh. It is customary to remove your hat when you want to come to a Adam Chashuv. Maybe, and it's exactly what they did in school. And that's what was done. So imagine what an interesting world it would be if we would like, wait a second, we're living in Germany. We walk around bareheaded. And for those of you who know Yeti Jews, this was not a big deal. Yes, when they were learning Torah, when they made a bracha on their own, they wore a kippah, they had it. But in the streets, part of Rav Hirsch's philosophy was this concept of not only Torah derech eretz, but der Mensch Israel. You have to be the Mensch. You have to be part of society. You have to say hello to people. And like you heard in the story, he removed his hat to two little children. And there was no yarmulke under his head, trust me. It was normal. It was done. And here's this Hungarian rabbi who becomes part of the German society and the posek of Germany in the next generation and a bastion of modern Orthodoxy. But Rav Hirsch did not subscribe. Therefore, the particular seminary that Hildesheimer opened, Rav Hirsch was not happy with it. And this began two trajectories of modern Orthodoxy in Germany. The one of Rav Hirsch, where you're open to Western culture, to society, to secular studies, but you are not open to investigate the sources of Judaism in a historical way. Azriel Hildesheimer, a great posek on his own, who wrote his own Shelot and Shuvot and Chidushim to the Talmud, totally open. Where in his seminary, in addition to the teaching of sources, as you heard, similar to Rav Hirsch, there was also the inquiry. And David Tzvi Hoffman, who eventually leaves Rav Hirsch's school, goes and joins this rabbinical seminary of Hildesheimer and teaches there. So now the future of Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy, is in the balance between these two giants who have developed two different methodologies. They are subject of non-debate, Torah, mitzvot, halacha, absolutely the same. One is open to historic inquiry, to history, to understanding sources, to figuring out what it is, and the other one is not. So Torah and derech eretz is a very broad idea, but what happens to this idea is part of what next week's lecture will all be about, and how that got hijacked and turned into something very different. So I thank you all for joining. And again, I want to thank Dr. Ann Winter for always being there and putting everything together and letting you all informed. I have a minute or two if you have a question. So if you have one, you can unmute yourself. And first of all, again, thank you for spending this hour. If anybody wants that little 50 or so book pamphlet of Herman Schwab, just send me an email at my very famous RAL, and then my age 4000, RAL 4000 at AOL, and I will gladly send it to you.